Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome again to the Wilderness Issue Lecture Series. Again, my name's Peter Metcalf. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, a man for whom many of you probably need no introduction, but Mr. David James Duncan is here to share some of his work with us tonight. And like many of you, my first experience of David's work was when I was about 19 or 20, and I had to read one of his books in a literature class when I was an undergraduate at Whitworth College, The Brothers K. And then after that, through the River Wye, and David actually came and spoke at my class. I don't know if he remembers that, but it was quite a profound experience. And I think, like a lot of people, his novels really resonated with us, especially at that maybe that young place in our life, whether that's chronological or otherwise, where we're searching for that way to be authentically in the world, and what those relationships with other people and with the rest of the natural world, and how those live out, and just through those really real and complicated characters. And so those novels, of course, have won quite a bit of recognition for that wonderful work. After that, David went on to write some more personal nonfiction, somewhat autobiographical work in River Teeth, My Story is Told by Water, and most recently his collection of essays, God Laughs and Plays. And in all of these books, or in all these collections of essays, as well as his other work, again, he really reflects on different ways in which we are connected to, and really speaks out of this deep concern and loving care for the natural world around us. And I've always found David's work to be some of the do what writing really does best, and that is it really calls us to see things in new and fresh ways, and to consider things in ways maybe that we haven't considered before. And I really like what Terry Tempest Williams and Barry Lopez has said about the writer's work, and part of their responsibility of paying attention to the world around us and then bearing witness to what's happening in so many different ways. And I think David's work really exemplifies that in terms of particularly his work around concern around salmon in the Pacific Northwest, wilderness, and any of these different places of the wild that incorporate our lives around us. His work is at times funny, it's often quite irreverent, but it's also always incredibly thoughtful and searing and poignant in the way that it considers these relationships. David's work has been awarded a number of different awards, including the Lemon Fellowship. He's won the Western States Book Award. He's run 3 Pacific Northwest Bookseller Awards. He was honored with the American Library Association's 2003 Award for the Preservation of Intellectual Freedom, and he's been awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Portland. Despite all that, David lists, and these are his words, not mine, that probably his best award is a Wilderness and Civilization grad and fine all-around person, Ellie Duncan, his daughter. So with that, I'd like to welcome David to the podium, and thank you for being with us here once again at the lecture series.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I get to use this. Great. You know, I might sit. I wrote this today, so I'm tired. Thanks for coming. To speak plainly for a bit, I gave a talk in this series in 2007 called The Wild Without, The Wild Within, which is based on my belief that there are 2 wildernesses, the kind they study at the university, the Bob, for example, then a wilderness that intersects the first kind but exists in our interiors. That this second wilderness exists isn't the opinion of one pissant fisherman from Lolo. If it was, you should ignore me. The interior wilderness is ancient wisdom, corroborated by Christian mystics, Sufis, Taoists, Tibetans, indigenous traditions. The interior wilderness is the Buddha Dharma. Speaking the Mountain and Water Sutra allowed for the first time to his monks in the 13th century. Zen Master Dogen said, "There are mountains hidden in swamps. There are mountains hidden in the sky. There are mountains hidden in mountains. There are mountains hidden in hiddenness. This is complete understanding. When you investigate mountains thoroughly, this is the work of the mountains. Mountains and waters of themselves become wise persons and sages." I love this take. Wisdom comes when the busy brain self dies down or loses track of itself, effaces itself, gets out of the mountains and waters and wildernesses way. Philosophy, said my friend Henry Bugby, who taught here, he was a legend here, died in 1999. Philosophy is not a making of a home for the mind out of reality. It's more like learning to leave things be. Restoration in the wilderness, here and now. William Stafford, another wonderful old friend, corroborates Henry. Sometimes in the open, you look up when birds go by, or just nothing, and wait. A dim feeling comes. You were like this once. There was air and quiet. It was by a lake or maybe a river. You were alert as an otter and were suddenly born like the evening star into wide, still worlds like this one you've found again for a moment. Something is being told in the woods. Aisles of shadow lead away, a branch waves, a pencil of sunlight slowly travels its path. A withheld presence almost speaks, but then retreats. You can feel the centuries ripple generations of wandering, discovering, being lost, eating, dying, being born. A walk through forest strokes the fur you no longer have, and your gaze down a forest aisle is a strange, long plunge, dark eyes looking for home. For delicious minutes, you feel your whiskers, wider than your mind, away out over everything. When I graduated from high school, which I more or less hated, I got drunk at the all-night party with everyone else, but the next morning felt called. I drove up into Oregon's Sandiam Wilderness, hiked into a high lake, and stayed beside it for 10 days, the last 7 of which I spent fasting on water and reading wisdom texts. I got really hungry and skinny and weak. I gave my parents a scare when they saw me weighing 130 pounds. I had one funny experience. I found a spring, and there were 3 Budweiser beers in it. I was 4 days into the fast. You're really sick after 4 days of fasting. I opened a Budweiser beer and tasted it, and was immediately what Edward Abbey would call a sadder Budweiser man. I've hated American industrial vat beer all my life, thanks to that moment. On the last day of the fast, I sat on a ski slope watching a rainstorm approach, and for delicious minutes felt the wild stroke fur I didn't have, felt whiskers wider than my mind fly away out over the clouds and forests and mountains. And my fast-breaking meal, a small box of raspberries from a farm stand on the way home, put me in ecstasy. I took a job the next summer that let me spend 3.5 months in the Wallowa Mountain Wilderness at 7,500 feet, 8 miles from the nearest road. There, the mountains and waters handed out so many de-selfing experiences that, as Irish poet Patrick Kavanagh put it, I gained a feeling that through a hole in reason's ceiling, we can fly to knowledge without ever going to college. In my mid-20s, I went trout fishing in the Cascades late in the day. I fished wilderness edges almost exclusively in those days. I'm a good hiker, and I could outdistance every other fisherman until it was just wild water, wild canyon, and me. In such a place, for the first time ever, I used 3-pound test line on the theory that very light line might deceive very big, very smart fish. And if you lost them, so what? You still had the thrill of knowing they lived there. It worked. At the witching hour just after sunset, I hooked not a trout, but a summer steelhead so ridiculously large and strong that I immediately knew I couldn't land it. But contact was a joy. To prolong contact, I released all pressure, all desire, all fish lust, let the steelhead do what it chose. It then threw me into a de-selfed state of wonder by choosing to continue its migration from the Pacific to its high mountain birth house, as if my hook and line and I weren't even there. As evening turned into moonless night, the world went black. A river canyon and the black of night aren't a good combo for those of us who need light to see. But the steelhead journeyed so serenely into this blackness that its wild serenity entered me. As the fish swam steadily, majestically upriver, I fumbled by feel through the boulders, and the predatory prey, fisherman quarry paradigm, melted away like blood and water. Rod in hand, enveloped by blackness, feeling the tail pulses of an uncatchably huge wild fish pulsing into my body through my hands. The St. John of the Cross phrase, "dark night of the soul," suddenly meant something to me. Led by an intensely felt companion living in another element, I trusted the blackness. When I finally chose to end the connection, the line broke so gently that I continued to feel an unbreakable line linking me to a vanished steelhead and to the wildness that created us both. I rewrote the manuscript that became the River Why around this experience, dubbing the thread the line of light. I was surprised when it resonated with thousands of readers. I later learned more about why. Early Coptic monks speak of a mystery running through our lives they call the indestructible connecting line. Rumi calls the same line the cord of causation. Socrates called it the fastening of heaven. The forest rishis who set down the original unwritten, completely oral Rig Veda call it the Sutratman, soul thread. The cold-blooded courage of a wild steelhead in blackness connected me to a universal reality I'd never even heard of at the time. My experience is that for navigating the Bob, we need excellent maps, GPS, or compasses. And navigating the interior wilderness, we need the song lines, spirit threads, and fastenings of heaven that William Stafford spoke of like so. The way it is, there's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. Henry Bugbee taught here for decades and was wonderfully cautionary about the student-teacher transaction. The world, he wrote, does not become less unknown in proportion to the increase of our knowledge about it. The more we experience things in depth, the more our experience of the world involves us in a mystery which can be intelligible to us only as mystery. Our true home is wilderness, even the world of every day. Exactly a year ago, I had a profound experience of wilderness intersecting with the world of every day. I was preparing a keynote for a writers' convention in Boise when something central to my everyday life changed dramatically. Because it threatened my ability to go to Boise at all, I sent an email to the friend arranging the event. It went like this: I'm at my mother's place. I'm at my mother's place in Lolo on day 15 of her home hospice. Yesterday I crossed the street to explore a little Bitterroot River locust grove and bottomland that nobody ever walks because private homes hem it in. I hadn't gone 300 yards before I'd spooked 21 white-tailed deer out in front of me. Also found deer hair-filled coyote scat and a fawn's entire rib cage, stripped down to an oversized off-white thumb piano with a single beetle running down a long, thin key. My Boise friend, Court Connolly's a poet and a fine man, guide on the Salmon River, the river of no return for over 30 years, destroyed his shoulders rowing. Instead of worrying about me not appearing to give the keynote, he immediately, like 10 minutes later, sent me this from Ted Kuzer. Mine is the craft of loss, but I am no better at losing than you. My skill is in finding the edges of sorrow and folding them in, as in the art of origami, wherein you take a paper by each of its corners and fold these in, then take the 4 new corners and turn these in again until in your hands is something new, a crane, a frog, a diversion. But the bird can't fly, nor the frog hop away on empty legs. My losses are as yours, insoluble. But may I make a gift for you, perhaps a paper teardrop. As my mother headed earthward, Court, other friends, and I began a long-distance conversation consisting of nothing but poems. And from Court, Jane Kenyon, let the light of late afternoon shine through chinks in the barn, moving up the bales as the sun moves down. Let the crickets take up chafing as a woman takes up her needles and her yarn. Let evening come. And from elsewhere, W.S. Merwin. All day the stars watch from long ago. My mother said, I'm going now. When you're alone, you will be all right. Whether or not you know, you will know. Look at the old house in the dawn rain. All the flowers are forms of water. The sun reminds them through a white cloud, touching the patchwork spread on the hill, the wash colors of the afterlife that lived there long before you were born. See how they wake without a question, even though the whole world is burning. If anybody I know has water, I really could use a sip of water. Oh, you got some for me? Oh, thank you. You're so much more efficient than I am. Thanks. I'm a climate change victim. The smoke 2 years ago, I've always had great lungs, and I'm asthmatic now. I've had bronchitis 3 times. Oh well. Mountains and waters of themselves become wise persons and sages. Those who know how to efface the self and let the situation itself instruct are spontaneously wise and a little wild. My mother had this ability in spades. She was a mass of contradictions, a Dogan of the neighborhood garage sale. She wore a blondish gray wig to conceal her thinning hair, yet was as verbally and emotionally honest as any person I can think of this side of sainthood. Her scores of friends knew it. Her passion late in life was collecting absolutely useless $1 and $2 tchotchkes she used to clutter her house so severely that I couldn't walk through without breaking things. She died the proud owner of 4 40-gallon bins of plastic flowers and a gigantic cheap print on her living room wall of the hideous self-portrait of Anthony Quinn. She loved bling and glitter and wore clothes and bracelets and rings covered with it, yet often remarked that if she were a man, she'd spend her adult life roaring around the West on a Harley. To prove it, she not only owned a beautiful Harley, this big, She went alone at age 80, all 5 feet of her, to see Willie Nelson live in Missoula and sat amid a swarm of his biker fans. When she moved to Lolo, she listed herself in the phone book as DJ Duncan because her name is Donna Jean. So every nutbag who ever wanted to talk to the other DJ Duncan got to talk to my mom. This was better for them. One night a guy called from Colorado, drunk, saying, "I need to talk to David." She said, "Why is that, dear?" He said, "Because I'm trying to be a river soldier and I'm not doing a very good job." It would have been way beyond my capacity to console that poor bastard. But my mom did. Her DJ Duncan phone book stunts went on and on. Based on people thinking she was me, she formed a stunning relationship with a woman who'd lost all 3 of her teenage sons in a plane crash because my mom lost a teenage son. The woman named Mom DJ D the elder, and me, DJ D the younger, and remains a friend. My younger brother Doug, who is not literary, lived with her a while and sometimes took phone calls meant for me. He knew I thought dimly of people being able to reach me by phone, so unlike Mom, he guarded me with gruff absolutism. When the Lannan Foundation called saying they wanted to speak to David James Duncan, Doug said, "He doesn't live here," and hung up. When they called back and said, "Do you know David?" Doug said, "Sure, he's my brother," and hung up. When they called back again and said, "But we want to give your brother some money, $70,000 in fact," Doug said, "Yeah, but what kind of hoops are you going to make him jump through first?" and hung up. He doesn't do math either. Thank God my mother figured it out. DJ the Elder was a lifelong conservative who voted for Nixon twice, then was so radicalized by George W. Bush that throughout her 80s she listened only to alternative radio, Bill Moyers, and MSNBC. She spent most of her life as a devout Seventh-day Adventist and was simultaneously the most adoring American-born fan of the Dalai Lama I've ever met. On her deathbed, she told me, Christian prayers were being said, and she whispered to me, "I think the Tibetans have it right." At about the same time my daughters left us an empty nest, my mom began to move with the tentativeness of a toddler and spoke with direct, increasingly childlike directness. Because she needed me to steady her walking, I then got to spend 3 more years walking around with the very small hand of a small, wise person clutching my arm. On our last road trip together, we drove to Oregon. I had to rent suites the whole way because my demure mother snored so loud I couldn't sleep even with earplugs. At our little suite on the Oregon coast, she gave me a day off to steelhead fish, and that evening I dragged an 11-pound hatchery steelhead into the tiny little cocktail sink in our shared room and cleaned it so that pretty soon it looked like Ted Bundy had been there. My mom found this hilarious. She was proud of me, but with caveats. One of the last times she toddled out to hear me speak in public, she sat down in the big lecture hall, watched me walk out on stage, watched my face as only a mother can as a ridiculously glowing introduction caused me to grow horrified, then leaned over and said to my sister, "You got to feel for David at these things, having to be on all the time, pretending to be so much smarter than he is." The sound of my sister laughing then calmed me right down. DJ D the Elder was keenly aware that her body, as Bill Kittredge likes to say, was headed for the wrong side of the grass. She loved Kittredge's figure of speech. One warm day the summer before last, I caught her staring at the lawn in her backyard, smiling in such a bemused way that I asked what was going on. She said, "Oh, I was just thinking about all the people I love on the wrong side of the grass. I know so many. I was looking at the grass, just wondering what they're up to under there." The older she grew, the more calm, truthful, and mysterious she grew, as Henry Bugby advised. Another time that summer, she confided to me that she sometimes went drifting. "Drifting?" I said, "What's that?" She said, "I'm only going to tell you this because I know you won't freak out and rush me off to an ER or something. All I'm saying is that sometimes I feel myself sort of leave myself in a way that makes me think, whoa, if I keep heading this way, I won't be here anymore. She smiled at the thought. It's not a stroke, not a health problem, not an illness. Feels mysterious but natural. A couple of times I went drifting till I was up on the ceiling, looking at myself lying on the couch down there. I'm not normally a Bible quoter, but I told my mother that her drifting reminded me of the second chapter of the book of Hosea, a violent piece of scripture full of strife and cursings and vexations, till suddenly it drifts ceilingward with this: Therefore I will now allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. From there I will give her vineyards and make a door of hope. There she shall respond as in the days of her youth. On that day, saith the Lord, you will call me my husband, and I will take you for my wife. I will take you for my wife. When an 88-year-old with an Adventist background hears the Bible say she's on the verge of becoming the wife of a hottie like the Lord, and that he's going to lead her into wilderness and give her vineyards, which implies wine, for which he had a low but enthusiastic tolerance, and that he's inviting her to call him husband, which implies you know what, and that she shall respond as in the days of her youth, which implies whoa, whoa, wow, I couldn't blame my mom for suspecting that not only her soul but her body were about to grow much, much younger. Her home hospice lasted 3 weeks and 4 days. For my siblings and me, it was intense, draining, dramatic, transformative, and very beautiful. In other words, it was wilderness. Before she went on hospice, I was on a writing roll. I have been working for years on a massive novel called Sun House. When she decided to stop fighting for life and take a gamble on drifting in the book of Hosea, I had great momentum, and it bothered her to see that interrupted. To appease her concern, I'd sit by her with my laptop at times and read a scene or two from the novel. I don't normally share work in progress, but there was a bit of Sun House that, well into her hospice, made my mother lose it laughing. What sent her was a fictitious Willie Nelson song. It's a little-known secret that it costs a bloody fortune to quote actual lyrics of hit songs in a novel thanks to copyright. 2 lines of Kenny Rogers' stupid song, The Gambler, cost me $300 in the Brothers K because I wanted to joke that it was Dostoevsky's The Gambler that I was quoting. In Jesus' Son, though, Dennis Johnson had a brilliant idea. He quotes a Neil Young song that went, "Hello, cowgirls in the sand, the whole wide world's at your command." And it didn't cost Dennis a penny because no such Neil Young song exists. I had the solution. So in Sun House, I have Willie sing a tune. Starts out with an acoustic guitar setting down an easygoing waltz. Then Willie chimes in. If I didn't have laryngitis, I might try to sing it, but I'll just recite it. So this is what turned my mom on very, very late in life. My cowboy pride and long-lost bride left me so lost and confused. Hopped on my Harley, cranked up Bob Marley, and rode to church for good news. But when the news was her body squeezing past me through the pews, I prayed, oh mercy, please don't curse me, sweet King of the Jews. Same mother who used to furiously pack us off to Adventist church lost it on her deathbed. More, she said. My will is strong, but church was long. Soon she was all I could see. Whether she'd kneel or just sit still, it was a love dance to me. We stood for song. Her legs were long. Her voice was bright and sincere. And when she eyed me as if to try me, Jesus erased all my fear. More, said my mom. Hear me, Creator. It's you who made her, and you who lured me in here. My tree of knowledge says she's my college, and I'm enrolling in there. Reception line chills down my spine. My gaze gets lost in her hair. Her blazing eyes, her rump and thighs. Oh, Lord, I'm walking on air. I better segue to how I came to like wilderness in the first place. When I was born, the family mythos was that you burn in hell forever if you're not an Adventist. The church-going practice by that faith made me feel like a Joseph held captive in Egypt. The end of my captivity came shortly after the death of my oldest brother. I was 13 at the time, John 17. He was my best friend, my protector, the noblest of big brothers, but he was born with a congenital heart defect. After 3 failed surgeries, his heart became too shredded to be repaired. It kept beating even so. This was hard. Though his doctors pronounced him doomed and couldn't help, John held on month after month. He contracted staph infection, tripling the certainty of doom, held on for weeks even then. I went to visit him many times during this limbo, but his inability to any longer be the person I loved, inability to launch the blithe, quirky conversations we'd always enjoyed. And yes, I was this superficial. His increasingly appalling appearance made me flee his room after very brief visits. I'd then huddle in the hospital hall, burning with shame at my inability to remain at his side. One evening after I'd left him this way, down the hall marched a stalwart young Adventist man fresh out of seminary with a Bible under his arm. This man had never met my family, didn't know my brother's prognosis. He was what some weathered old priests call a faith monster. His confidence in his belief system, systematic indeed and blind and total. When he saw me slumped on the floor, he asked if I was John's brother. I stood to be respectful and allowed that I was. He then swooped like a sparrowhawk on a vole, seizing my shoulders, gazing with crazy intensity into my eyes, and said, "Faith can move mountains. If you pray for your brother hard enough, with a pure enough heart, you can save his life." You can imagine what then happened. When my brother died 2 days later, I blamed myself. Hadn't prayed hard enough, wasn't pure enough of heart. My small dose of doubt-laced faith had failed to move those big mountains. That moment never left me. A faith-filled zealot with intentions as pure as any suicide bomber had more or less stuck a knitting needle he called faith in my heart. It stayed there hurting like hell for years, but then I realized something. I wasn't helpless. I pulled the damn thing out and started to write with it. The way it is, there's a thread I then began to follow. I'd heard at church as a child that the kingdom of heaven was within me, but our preachers declaimed a faith that excluded everyone I knew but a small fold of yay-sayers. Whereas the first time I walked up a trout stream in wilderness, rod in hand, I was struck all day and on thousands of days to follow by a suspicion that mountains and rivers are myself turned inside out. The earth's capacity to create a stage and 10,000 intricate living characters, sustain those characters, destroy them, then resurrect the whole thing from scratch, begin to move me fiercely. And how wonderful, truly, that a heart wound can become both guiding scar and guiding star, that a perceived enemy can become a teacher. Yes, I was seared as a boy by those words, faith can move mountains, etc. But it sure made sense out of Anne Lamott's statement, the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty. Or Amory Lovin's wonderful statement, in God we trust. Everyone else, bring data. And what better preparation could I have been given than the same words and the same long hurt for the words of Duncan. Thanks to a wound suffered in a hospital hallway, Duncan, 725 years after speaking, stood my hair on end when he said, "Mountains and waters right now are the actualization of the ancient Buddha way. Because they've been the self since before all form arose, they are liberated and realized, and mountains are always walking. Clearly examine mountains walking in your own walking. Mountains always abide in ease and always walk. Do not doubt it, even though it does not look like human walking. The Buddha ancestors' words point to mountains walking. This is fundamental understanding. You should penetrate these words. Thanks to a thread that only wounded a 13-year-old, it thrilled me to learn just a few years ago that mountains do indeed walk. That the Tetons in Wyoming, for example, are growing at a rate of about 1.5 inches a year, 9 feet in my measly lifetime. Though their great slow strides don't look like ours, I don't doubt it even so. Buddha ancestors point to mountains walking. The German who first discovered continental drift and theorized the shifting tectonic plates that enable mountains to walk was named Alfred Wegener. When he presented his ideas to the Royal Geographic Society in London, he was derided as a fool. This derision continued for half a century because Wegener was German, those world wars. Only in my lifetime has the physical means and manner of mountains walking been studied, measured, partially understood. Come ride my spirit thread into wilderness for a few minutes here. It turns out the walking of mountains is an effing miracle, born of the fact that our earth is a shard of ancient star. It turns out mountains don't just walk, they firewalk. It turns out Dogen Zenji is a better scientist than the British Royal Geographic Society. It turns out mountains walk so vigorously you could drive from the city to the nearest walking mountains and find seashells on summits that will have awaited your touch since that mountain was sea. It turns out the seminarian who seared me with words about mountain-moving faith and brother-saving prayers initiated a shifting of tectonic plates and a kind of firewalking in me. It turns out this firewalking moved me to believe so firmly that faith and Buddha ancestors do indeed move mountains that I too was moved 20 years after my brother died to save his life, to quote the knitting needle guy, by writing a little memoir about my brother, the Mickey Mantle koan, that restored vital pieces of his life to public memory after embalming fluid and the banal words of yet another scripture-citing cleric had assaulted our frail memories of John at a memorial service that should have been called a forgetting service. Then Stan Musial and Bill Spaceman Lee and Mickey Mantle himself liked what I wrote. So I used the same knitting needle pen to restore more big brotherliness to the world via a major work of fiction, The Brothers K, that dove so deep into the bewilderness and magic of big brothers and ball sport and Bible-crazed families that 1,000 readers wrote astounding letters describing their own brothers and sisters and war experiences and religious and spiritual struggles and wounds and guiding soul threads. It turns out I still get such letters. It turns out this vast interactive field effect, though it originated in agony in a hospital hall, created such a profound sense of resolution and peace that one night, maybe 30 years after John died, I had a vivid dream of a dark brown girl of 15 or 16, wearing a white blouse and long, colorful skirt, walking down a dirt road, hips swaying a little as she passed under trees from which lemurs peered, making me think, Madagascar. It turns out this girl's bemused half smile left me sure she was thinking about a boy because that was the way John smiled when he was thinking about a girl. It turns out that because I'd been trying to penetrate the way mountains and people walk, I noticed even in mid-dream that this girl's walk had a languid ease that reminded me of my long-vanished brother's walk. It turns out I'll never say she was my brother. The opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty. But her bearing and being were so familiar and so at peace on her quiet dirt road that I felt nothing but that peace when I thought of John ever since. It turns out I don't know whether faith moves mountains, but I know that mountains move mountains. It turns out I don't know whether praying hard enough with a pure enough heart saves the lives of those we love and lose by helping them reboot in, say, Madagascar. But I do know that imagining and writing hard enough with a pure enough heart helped carry my grief for my brother to a fulfilling end. Excuse me. It turns out that peace-infused grief is now part of a thread that goes among things that change but doesn't change, creating so much strength and faith and familiarity that this last year, exactly a year ago, as my sibs and I tended our mother during hospice, we didn't slump helplessly in any hallways or get soul molested by any clerics or submit to despair. It turns out we stood by her bed in her small house on a small lake and served till a soul and body parted ways, and that parting was as moving as any music I've ever loved. It turns out that around the day she lost her ability to swallow, the birds called swallows, violet greens mostly, arrived en masse at her little lake and began feeding on the March browns, gray drakes, and other mayflies that were hatching. It turns out the afternoon after the swallows' arrival, a cold front hit, heavy snow began falling, and I feared the birds might starve. It turns out that toward dusk, the hatches of insects swarmed the lakeside houses of the neighborhood for the warmth leaking from doors and windows, and the swallows, again en masse, found them there and hovered against the human homes into the darkness, picking insects off the siding, glass, and eaves with such one-pointedness you could walk in among them, experiencing some marvelous avian human border as their wings brushed your clothes and rustled your hair. It turns out that after studying and translating the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Robert Thurman summarized the Tibetan belief about death thus: all beings are. They never are not. They are either alive or between. There is hypothetically a split second between life and the between that is properly called death, a boundary, a line with no width, something ultimately not there except as an arbitrary border. It turns out that Tibetans and Mother Nature and swallows and mayflies and the explosion of renewed life that enveloped my mother's dying all agree that the opposite of life isn't death after all. It's unmanifest life. It turns out it was me who found the little lakeside house that lured DJD the Elder to Lolo, Montana from Maui, Hawaii. A trajectory she loved to describe to Hawaiian friends because Lolo in Hawaiian means crazy, and that's what they thought she was. It turns out that on the day the realtor unlocked that house and I got ready to try to sell my mom on it, I didn't have to open my mouth because as the front door swung open and we looked straight through the house to the lake behind, a raft of Canada geese launched up off the water, and Mom turned to me and said, "I think someday I'd like to launch up from here too." It turns out that as she was taking her last breath by the same lake, and geese were again repeatedly launching, a daft mother mallard landed outside Mom's glass bedroom window for the first time in the 12 years she'd lived there, walked over to a rock-covered flower bed about 8 feet from her bed and laid 4 eggs in the cold, snowy stones in 4 days. It turns out that during those days, my mother occupied a border between life and the between and sometimes spoke from that border, once asking me, "And are they coming with a ladder to bring me on up?" It turns out I have no idea, but I was incontrovertibly moved to answer yes, all the way up. It turns out that when she grew too weak to speak but not too weak to nod, I asked if it would disturb her if I mowed what we had for 12 years called her lawn, though in the confusion of pronouns at the time of a human unmaking, it was becoming our lawn. It turns out she faintly nodded, and I went out and started mowing. My brother Steve stayed by her bedside, and he said the growl of the engine caused her to smile, and, quote, a peace came over her. It turns out that later, when she'd lost the ability to react to anything south of whatever comes next, a hospice preacher offered to send in a harp player trained to time her music to our mother's dying breaths. It turns out my brother Steve told the preacher, oh, that's okay. If Mom seems to want more peace, we'll just have David start the mower and walk back and forth outside the window. It turns out that amid a spring snow flurry, my mother then did launch from her home by the lake, and after we'd said goodbye to her body, I walked out at dawn, collected the mallard eggs from the cold rocks, despite the snow that covered them, sent them to a chicken fancier friend with an incubator, and when one egg proved viable, I thought I'd name the duck Madagascar. Madagascar died trying to fight her way out of the shell, as many of us do. But then it turns out that after my mom was gone, I mowed her lawn 21 times, feeling that peace that the mower gave her each time, till we sold the little house. And after every mowing, I sat on the little grass beach by the lake, where I watched 3 broods of baby mallards be born, 21 Madagascars in all, born in the little wilderness yard my mom lit out from. It turns out I don't know squat about the afterlife, though DJD the Elder is in it, but I know that there's an invisible thread some of us follow, and a line of light connecting me to a migrating steelhead still, and a night thread connecting me to a road lined with trees and lemurs, where a girl with swaying hips and a bemused smile healed me of my brother grief, even though she lived in dream. It turns out that receiving a plethora of beautiful death poems and unmanifest life poems in the weeks after DJD the Elder launched, I realized a third mother to all of us might be the words poets gather like mallard eggs abandoned in stones and try to incubate, sometimes causing something warm and deathless to make itself felt. Like this from Mary Oliver. When death comes like the hungry bear in winter, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, this cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea. And I consider eternity another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower as common as a field daisy and as singular. My mother's favorite flower. And each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending as all music does towards silence. And each body a lion of courage precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. Thank you very much. I know you need to run away, Ellie. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for that. That was wonderful, David.
Thanks.
What we'd like to do now is open it up to some question and answer time if people have any questions for David. And again, I'll bring the mic around, so if you just raise your hand, and we'll start from there.
Yeah. I'm still on a long home stretch. I really hope it comes out next year. I think I'll finish, well, the due date is August 31st. It's 1,000 pages. It's kind of like a 2-week spiritual retreat in novel form. When I was little, somebody told me they pay by the pound. But actually, Obama has a program for novelists. It's called too fucking long to fail. So even if the novel is shit, you have to pay taxes and read it or throw it away, carry it around. Because that's the way us too long guys are. Yeah. Sorry.
Hey, good evening, David. As someone else who's often trying to accumulate these lines of wisdom literature, curious your methodology for keeping it all straight. Are you big on just Post-its? How's this accumulating?
I am. I don't know if you know James Hillman's distinction between puer consciousness and senex consciousness, but I'm a pretty classic puer. I like to surround myself with talismans and beautiful phrases. In my study, I look at a river tooth and a Cambodian Buddha image that look, the Buddha image made out of metal, the river tooth spruce, probably 1,000 years old, from an estuary on the Oregon coast. And the spruce was obviously in the river that carved the tree down to just this, basically it's the negative of what would be a knot where the limb starts in a tree, just a tooth about this. It looks, the river was carving a Buddha. They look very alike. And I really like seeing that much art in a river, things like that. I have somebody gave me a Bhutanese prayer wheel. It says Om Mani Padme Hum inside it, written like 20,000 times on a scroll of paper. Supposedly each time you spin it, you get the benefit of all those blessings. I don't believe that for 1 second. I just think it's pretty. I think spirit lets you know when it's intense and alive, and that words have a lifespan. Things will really move me for a while. Actually, Dogen, the guy I was quoting, I wish I had Dogen's phrase. He says, don't try to memorize the 84,000 verses. The one verse, that speaks to your heart, that's the one that should be pasted to the wall in front of you for a while.
Other questions?
I'd just like to thank you for sharing your thoughts. That was a creation that you prepared for us and shared, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you. Maybe it's time for a beer. Thank you very much for coming.